different novelists, both of whom have been translated into over 20 languages. Both of their novels grapple with characters facing the end of life. It's recording, yes. My very favorite fiction reading at Hudson Valley Writers Center was when Sigrid read from The Friend in January of 2020. Sigrid Nunez has published 8 novels, including The Friend, a New York Times bestseller, and she's won many prestigious awards, including the 2018 National Book Award. Her most recent novel, What Are You Going Through?, is about the looming death of our planet from climate change and the death of the narrator's school friend. She wrote it before the pandemic, but it was published during the pandemic, and its dual concerns resonate even more deeply now, including the controversial belief held by the narrator's ex-husband, a climate change scholar, that the most ethical thing humans can do now is stop having children. His talks center on the ways climate change, bioterrorism, the inevitability of a pandemic, far-right governments, and corporate greed are all threats to life, freedom, and society. In a New York Times book review, Janice Lee wrote, "In What Are You Going Through?, Nunez tells the simplest of stories about a woman accompanying a terminally ill friend through her last months and expands it into an exploration of the largest themes, nothing less than the realities of living and dying in this world and how we feel about both." In a recent interview with Terry Gross on NPR, Sigrid spoke about writing a novel about euthanasia in the context of the pandemic. She said, "One of the things that people didn't think about was that these people who were not able to have their loved ones with them at the end has been one of the great brutalities of this situation. It feels even more real in a way, that idea that you could be completely alone. There are many reasons why we want this pandemic to come to an end, but that is one of the main ones, because I think that is one of the most terrible consequences of the pandemic." There are so many memorable, quotable lines in What Are You Going Through? Here's just one. Quote, "Someone has said, when you were born into this world, and there are at least two of you, but going out, you were on your own. Death happens to every one of us, yet it remains the most solitary of human experiences, one that separates rather than unites us. Please help me welcome Sigrid Nunez."
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer, for that beautiful introduction. And I'm very pleased and grateful to the Hudson Valley Writers Center for having me. And thank all of you for being here. So I am going to be reading from my novel, What Are You Going Through? And as Jennifer said, there are the two main characters here. There is the narrator and her friend who has terminal cancer. And they are hanging out together in an Airbnb. The friend who's ill has been having a lot of trouble reading because she has very poor concentration. And so sometimes the narrator reads to her. And they've just finished a mystery novel. And now they're trying to decide what to read next. I had some recently published novels on my Kindle, but my friend wasn't interested in listening to any of them. She didn't like what she called the vandalizing streak in contemporary fiction writers. She quoted John Cheever on the difference between a fascinated horror of life and a vision of life. Nowadays, it seems to be mostly fascinated horror, she said. Either that or totally unconvincing platitudinous sentiment. All these books about the horribleness of modern life, she said. A lot of them brilliant. I know. You don't have to tell me, but I don't want to read any more about narcissism and alienation and the futility of relationships between the sexes. I don't want to read any more about human, in particular male, hideousness. Whatever happened to Faulkner's idea that a writer's job was to lift people up? How Faulkner chastised the young writer of his day. He writes as though he stood among and watched the end of man. He writes not of the heart, but of the glands. It was out of fear that the writer wrote this way, Faulkner said, the fear he shared with every other person on earth, the fear of being blown up. But it was the writer's duty to rise above such fear, Faulkner said. Valor was what Faulkner was calling for that day in Stockholm in 1950. And then a return to the old universal truths, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice, absent which, Faulkner warned, your story will last but a day. Fine words, really fine words, but of all the ways of looking at a writer today, as a knight in shining armor strikes me as probably the most far-fetched. Another time, my friend said to me, you'd think it would be easier to leave life if you could convince yourself that everything was horrible and the future was totally bleak. But I can't bear to think that I'll be gone and the world won't go on infinitely rich, infinitely beautiful. Take that away and there's no consolation. I myself, as I told my friend now, have always been haunted by a scene from an old movie I once saw based on the lives of the Bronte family. One of the sisters, who knows she's dying, says that because she's always been afraid of life, she doesn't so much mind leaving it. But then on a day like this, she says, when the world is so beautiful, she is sitting somewhere outdoors, I recall, no doubt somewhere in the moors. She confesses that she wouldn't mind living just a little longer. I'd been channel surfing, and that was the only scene I watched. It was long ago, I could be remembering it wrong, but this was how it always came back to me, and it came back to me a lot. Meanwhile, I was scanning a large bookcase in the living room. How about this, I said, pulling a heavy book from the bottom shelf. The world's best folk and fairy tales. Gods and heroes, princes and peasants, giants and little people, witches, tricksters, and animals, animals, animals. This would be our reading from now on. She could not get enough of it. Much has been said about mystery stories being like fairy tales and popular for some of the same reasons. Instead of ogres, serial killers. And though they might not be pure of heart, no princes or Galahads or saints, the detectives are still heroes, righteous, if not always noble avengers. All is simplified, characters, types, moral code clear, where guilt or innocence lie, plain. Plenty of cruelty, violence, and gore, but in the end, the evil are vanquished, and even if the good don't live happily ever after, there is closure, the kind of closure that mostly eludes people in real life. Except that fairy tales are beautiful, my friend said. Fairy tales are sublime, and mysteries are not. Another difference, unlike mysteries, fairy tales are not escapist. Even if they too simplify and conform to familiar formulas, the truths in fairy tales are always run deep. That is why children love them. Who knows better than a child what it's like to be at the mercy of hidden and arbitrary forces, and that anything can happen, no matter how strange, either for good or for ill. Fairy tales are real. They are more mysterious than any mystery novel. That is why, unlike mystery novels meant to entertain, then be forgotten, fairy tales are classics. They are of the heart, not of the glands. I like that we owe fairy tales to old women. When the idea came to people to collect those of a given region, they began by taking down the tales told by its crones. What's your favorite fairy tale? My friend wanted to know. Anyone that has swans in it, I said. I remember when I first read The Six Swans, how I wanted to be the brother whose magic shirt his sister doesn't have time to finish. So when he's turned back into a human being, he still has one wing. You wanted to be the freak. Well, I didn't think of it that way. Maybe just the different one, I said. The one who gets to keep part of his swan being. That appealed to me. Here's something I wonder about, my friend said. They say people love thrillers and horror stories because it's such fun to escape ordinary life and lose yourself in a world of gruesome violence and crime. Yes? Yes. So why aren't romance novels full of bad sex with smelly people? That is not a logical analogy, I said. Okay, never mind. Chemo brain, she said. We had taken to sitting side by side on the sofa when we were together in the living room, semi-recumbent with our legs stretched out and our feet up on the coffee table. More than once while I was reading, she fell asleep. I would stop reading and keep very still, alternately soothed and tormented by the sound of her breathing. I would remember the vigil at my father's hospital bedside when his breathing had become so labored that it was as if there were some malfunctioning machine in the room, and the shock of its ceasing like that, as if the machine had been switched off, and the silence that followed, louder than his breathing had been, louder than any machine, louder than anything I'd ever heard before in my life. Or we'd sit together in the same position on the two-seater on the back porch from where we liked to watch the sunset. Sometimes we linked arms or clasped hands. At such moments, I felt that she was as much a comfort to me as I was meant to be to her. Every now and then she would squeeze my hand without saying anything, without needing to say anything, but it was as if she had squeezed my heart. Golden hour, magic hour, l'heure bleue. Evenings when the beauty of the changing sky made us both go still and dreamy. Sunlight falling at an angle across the lawn so that it touched our elevated feet, then moved up our bodies like a long, slow blessing. And I found myself a breath away from believing that everything was as it should be. See the moon, count the stars, there all the time without you and ever shall be, world without end. Joyce, infinitely rich, infinitely beautiful. Everything was going to be all right. I'll stop there. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sigrid. That was wonderful. Everyone loves this book. If you haven't read it, please get it. I read it when I was in Cape Cod getting married during the pandemic, and it was a joy to have that with me. Thank you for that reading, Sigrid. That was wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So now, Russell Banks is twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He is one of America's most prestigious fiction writers. He is a member of the Academy of Arts and Letters. During a career stretching almost half a century, he has published an extraordinary collection of novels. He's received numerous prizes and awards, including the Commonwealth Award. He is the author of brave, morally imperative novels, as Ron Charles writes in his review of Forgone in the Washington Post. Banks traces the forces that influence whole societies as deftly as he explores the impulses that drive ordinary people. The protagonist of Forgone is Leo Fife, a documentary filmmaker who has stopped his cancer treatment. The novel explores Leo grappling with memory and the past as he agrees to a last interview in which he will divulge his final secrets. The novel is an astonishing testament to how we never really know anyone, not even ourselves, and the way human obsession with forgiveness and redemption can consume us right up to the end of our lives. Banks writes, the second his cancerous body shuts his brain down, his memories will be vaporized. This is his first glimpse of the larger world beyond him, his first awareness that he was only a tiny cellular part of that world, filled him with an unsayable solitude and a terrible fear that he could instantly be absorbed by that larger world. When a child discovers that he is not his mother, and worse, his mother is not the entirety of the universe, he perceives the utter absurdity and meaninglessness of his separation from the world. This is how Fyfe saw himself when he first saw himself. Then, for a lifetime, until now, 77 years later, he hid that sight from himself. Please help me welcome Russell Banks.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thank you very much. And also thank you, Sigrid, for your reading. It's lovely to be here with you. I admire your work and you so and it's interesting how here we are writing about some of the same events in human life. And I wonder if that has something to do with, I know it has something to do with my age, although you're somewhat younger than I, so I get you're making a greater leap with the imagination perhaps than I am. But I'm delighted and honored to be reading with you here today. I'm going to read two excerpts from the novel. It's a difficult novel to excerpt because it runs on two different planes. One is the narrative which describes the actual documentary filmed interview of Leonard Fyfe by his acolyte, a man named Malcolm, and his crew in the home of Leonard Fyfe in Montreal, Quebec, on April 1st, 2018. And that's a kind of a black box interview. And then there is the other alternating narrative, which are Leonard Fyfe's memories and his account for those memories as he's participating in this interview. But the first little excerpt will kind of set it up, and you'll understand a whole lot then later of the excerpt from a later chapter. Malcolm, who is the acolyte filmmaker, interviewer, called the Ken Burns of the North at one point, so to give you an idea of where he is at. Leonard Fyfe himself is a very famous in Canada leftist documentary filmmaker who fled to Canada with 60,000 other American men in the late 60s, early 70s to avoid the draft or avoid being sent to Vietnam in the military. So they were deserters or resistors. And he stayed there and became this muckraking kind of famous documentary filmmaker. And now here he is in his late 70s and dying of cancer and being treated for that, and he's given up treatment and he's just doing this final interview. Malcolm says Fyfe's name and the date, April 1, 2018, and location, Montreal, Quebec, and claps his hands once in front of Vincent's FS7. The camera is attached to a tripod on a track that orbits the circle of light on the bare floor and stares at the featureless flat black side of Fyfe's face like the dark side of the moon. The unseen side is lit by the overhead spot. His silhouette has a molten golden edge, penumbra surrounded by impenetrable black space. Malcolm is right. Fyfe still has a beautiful, brooding, bald head. at least in profile. The illness and chemo have dissolved a quarter of his body, liquefying his flesh, pushing forward the long arc of his nose and his cheekbones and prominent chin and the plates of his skull. He looks like a polished Roman coin. For a few seconds, everyone is silent, waiting for Malcolm's first question. But suddenly, Fyfe says that he's going to answer a question that nobody knows to ask today. The question, he says, is simply this: why did you decide in the spring of 1968 to leave the United States and migrate to Canada? For nearly 50 years, he's been answering that question, creating and reaffirming the widespread belief, at least among Canadians, that Leonard Fyfe was one of the more than 60,000 young American men who fled to Canada in the late 1960s and early 1970s in order to avoid being sent by the US military to Vietnam. Those 60,000 men were either draft dodgers or deserters. For half a century, Leonard Fyfe was believed to be a draft dodger. It's what he claimed on the day he crossed the border from Vermont into Canada and asked for asylum. He's claimed it ever since that day. The truth, however, is always more complicated and ambiguous. Therefore, consider the preceding as merely a preface. For here begins Malcolm McLeod's controversial film, Oh, Canada. Although brilliantly shot and edited by McLeod and produced by his wife Diana in the late Leonard Fyfe's own manner, it is in some ways a disheartening, disillusioning film about Fyfe, one of Canada's most celebrated and admired documentary filmmakers. Oh, Canada shocked and disappointed the millions of Canadians who admired Leonard Fyfe for being one of those 60,000 Americans who fled north in the late 1960s to escape being sent by the American government to kill or die in Vietnam. While his film Deathbed Confession may have been cathartic for Fyfe himself, it has brought many Canadians to question their past and present national policy of offering asylum to so-called refugees. Refugees are people who have fled their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution if they return home. They are assumed to have seen or experienced many horrors. A refugee is different from an immigrant. An immigrant is a person who chooses to settle permanently in another country. Refugees are thought to enforce to flee. Leonard Fyfe claimed to be a refugee. I'm going to jump to a place fairly far into the novel where you'll begin to see the difficulties of merging his memories and his narrative of his memories and truth-telling to the camera and to the people in the room, the most important of which, or two most important of which, is his wife, Emma, whom he is confessing the truth of his past, and his nurse, a Haitian nurse who is taking care of him, and it operates in the novel as a kind of, I don't know, Greek chorus. She's the anchor for reality and truth in some ways, because Leonard Fyfe himself is affected by the chemo, by his own lapse of memories, and by his confusion, and by a kind of confabulation that occurs under these circumstances. Cutting into Fyfe's scrambled and scrambling account of what sounds like one of his many adulteries, Malcolm announces it's time to take a break. He and Diana need to consult privately. Who the hell was Amanda? Where the fuck is this going? Is he just making it up? Among the others, except for Fyfe, there is an air of relief, an audible exhalation. They haven't been able to follow where Fyfe has tried to lead them and are confused by the meandering route he has taken and exhausted from trying to keep up with him. They don't understand his evasion of Malcolm's and Diana's prepared questions, his stubborn refusal to be properly interviewed. They don't know what to believe. Does it matter? Everyone remains silent. After a few moments, Emma says in a choked voice, "It's the medications. Sometimes he confabulates. It's like he's dreaming. We shouldn't be doing this," she suddenly tells Malcolm. She asks him to destroy what they've shot so far. It's not even half true. Most of what he's saying is misremembered and half invented or completely made up. It's wrong to be filming it, Malcolm, even if you end up not using it. The lights come on and Fife looks around at the 6 others, Renee, that's the nurse, and Emma seated on the sofa behind him, Sloane and Vincent standing by the camera, Diana clutching her clipboard in the corner of the room, Malcolm standing next to Fife in his wheelchair in the center of the room in front of the camera. Malcolm lays his hand on Fife's skeletal shoulder and softly pats it. Renee tells Fife that it's past time for her to empty his bag and give him his prednisone. Diana says to no one in particular, though it's clearly directed to Emma, that Leo seems to want to continue, so why not let him? It'll all come together and make sense when it's edited. She likes the stuff about his early ambitions to be a poet and writer. It's relevant to his shift to film, and people will want to hear about his American years in the 1960s, she points out. Okay, some of it's a little too personal and private maybe and not very clear, but that can be edited out so no one's hurt or confused. A lot of this can be cut. The 2.25 hours they've shot so far might come down to barely 15 minutes of screen time, for instance. Sloane asks, this is a young woman who's doing the sound. Sloane asks, "Did you really not know about this, Emma? I mean, the wife in Virginia and the son and the other wife, the first one, and the baby girl?" "Jesus, Sloane, leave it alone," Malcolm says. He tries explaining to her and probably to himself and the others as well that all kinds of things have been mixed together in Fife's mind. He quotes Emma, "It's the meds, confabulation, memories, hallucinations, fiction and films, other people's stories, fantasies. It's like trying to tie a novel to the author's real life," he says. "You can't do it. We shouldn't worry. Emma knows the story of Fife's life better than anyone. She's been living and working with him for 40 years. "I'm sorry," Sloane says. "I didn't mean to." Emma says, "I know everything about him that I need to know." "Jesus, you're talking about me as if I'm not in the fucking room," Fife says. "Like I can't hear you. I do hear you." Emma says, "You're right, darling. I'm sorry." Malcolm says he's sorry too. "Come on, folks. This is Leo's show, not ours," he reminds them. Renee releases the brakes on Fife's wheelchair and declares that she must take Monsieur Fife back to his room for a few moments. If they wish to continue today with the filming and Monsieur Fife feels strong enough to comply and wishes to do it, she will bring him back to the living room. She looks at Emma as she says this, as if it is Emma's decision whether to continue the filming. Then straightway she wheels him from the room. As they cross the dark hallway and pass into the dining room, Fife, speaking English, says to Renee, "I'm not confabulating, you know. I'm really not. And it's not the meds. And Emma's wrong," he says. "She doesn't know everything about me that she needs to know. He did live in Virginia where he was married and he had a son. And before that, there was an 18-year-old girl he met in Florida and he got her pregnant and married her when he was 19 and went with her to Boston where they had a daughter. He insists it's all true. He remembers it like it happened yesterday. Do you believe me?" he asks Renee. She answers, "Je crois que vous croyez c'est vrai. I believe that you believe it's true." She wheels him through the kitchen and on to the bedroom and bathroom that he has not shared with his wife for nearly 2 months. He wonders how much he was able to say to the camera this morning of what he actually remembers. He knows there is a synaptic snafu between the data received from the memory banks of his hippocampus and his prefrontal cortex that scrambles the words he is led to speak when he tries to convert that data to speech. It is another reason for wanting Emma there. She's the only one who can bridge the gap between his memories and his description of them, as if he is speaking in a language that only she and he understands. He and Emma are his brain's only native speakers. This is love, is it not? It's the same as when he first wakens, but is not yet completely awake, or when he begins to fall asleep and has not yet fully entered sleep. He speaks aloud, half inside a dream and half outside it. And Emma, lying next to him or reading silently in a nearby chair, says, "What? What are you talking about, Leo?" And he says, "It's nothing, nothing. I was dreaming." But he wasn't dreaming. He was caught for a few seconds between being asleep and being awake, and the two worlds briefly overlapped. And there was a break, a gap between what he was seeing and hearing and what he could say of it. And he was unable to speak from that gap and had to cry out like a mountain climber fallen into a glacial crevasse, suspended from his rope, calling for help to a search party miles away. His rescuers hear bits and pieces of his cries carried on the wind, but are unable to make out the words or determine where they're coming from. His speech is not garbled or blocked in any way, the way it would be if he had suffered a stroke or an injury to his brain. He's not aphasic. He's almost two separate people, and one of them remembers in great detail a distant past, and the other, who does not remember anything of that past, tries to describe it. The conflict causes a loud sparking static that makes it nearly impossible for him to hear what he is saying, just as he cannot see what the camera is seeing. He no more knows what he sounds like through Sloane's mic than he knows what he looks like to Vincent's camera and to the 6 other people in the room. He is sure that he has said nothing that is not true. He has not lied, but he does not know what he has said. Maybe that's how it goes when you have not lied. You don't know what you said. Only liars know what they have said. Renee unclips the bag of urine from the catheter tube and empties the bag into the toilet. She wraps her arms around Fife from behind and eases him from the wheelchair to the toilet. He is not paralyzed, but his limbs and trunk are too feeble to carry the weight of his body. He has lost nearly half his 200 pounds of muscle and bone, and it is as light as he was at 14. She slips his sweatpants down his scrawny thighs and goes to the door and tells him to call her when he's ready to be wiped, and leaves him alone, sitting on the toilet with his pants puddled at his ankles. There is nothing left of his life now except what's in his brain and the fluids that pass through his bowels and bladder and the cancer cells that are devouring his bones and flesh, munching on his organs, shutting them down one by one. He has not been able to digest solids for weeks. He hasn't had sex with Emma or anyone else for 3 years, nor has he managed to ejaculate for nearly a year. No one who isn't being paid for it wants to touch his body. Not even Emma, not even he himself. What's left of his life now, who he is only what's inside his brain, which is only who he was, nothing more. The future does not exist anymore, and the present never did, and no one knows who he was. No one can know unless he tells her, Emma. He could go silent the way he stopped eating, an act of will made easy by exhaustion and the drugs that have killed his appetite. But if he goes silent, he will disappear. Except for his memories, all living traces of his past, all the witnesses and evidence have been erased by years of betrayal, abandonment, divorce, annulment, flight, and exile. Eaten by time the way his body is being eaten by cancer. Time, like cancer, is the devourer of our lives. When you have no future and the present doesn't exist except as consciousness, all you have for a self is your past. And if, like Fife, your past is a lie, a fiction, then you can't be said to exist except as a fictional character. In telling his story to Emma, Fife is not trying to correct the record. He's trying to stay alive. Or more accurately, he's trying to come to life, like a Pinocchio, a puppet made of wood, ingeniously carved and assembled so as to closely resemble a real human being, a much admired Canadian documentary filmmaker, a teacher, a beloved friend and husband, a trusted man of the left dedicated to exposing hypocrisy, greed, and political corruption. But he's really only a wooden puppet whose strings are frayed and broken one by one, and now his clever maker, Leonard Fife, the man himself, the village woodcarver, can no longer make him dance and play at being a real boy anymore. He lies collapsed in the corner of the woodcarver's hut, a pile of sticks and cloth, until the big, strong Haitian nurse returns to the bathroom and lifts him away from the toilet and wipes his buttocks clean of dribbled shit and reattaches his penis to the tube and swings his body back into the wheelchair. Who is he then? Renee asks him if he wishes to rest in bed or lie on the chaise by the bedroom window. Fife tells her to take him back to the living room. She says that if he returns to the living room, she will have to attach him to the IV. If you insist on continuing with the interview, you will need nourishment and hydration. You are being very foolish, Monsieur Fife. Those people are only interested in making their movie. Madame Fife does not want you to waste your strength on this project. Let her tell them to go away, and if you are strong enough to continue tomorrow, they can come back then. Fife smiles at her. He says, it's like I'm the old Italian carpenter Geppetto, the guy who made a puppet out of wood named Pinocchio. But I'm too old and feeble now to pull the strings for the puppet show. For the first time, the puppet has to put on the show all by himself. I'm Geppetto, but I'm the puppet too. The wooden puppet, who thanks to the intervention by the blue-haired fairy was resurrected as a real boy. How does my nose look, Renee? Check it out. Is it longer today than yesterday? Your nose looks the same as always. Did you ever read the story of Pinocchio, Renee? No, but I have heard of it. It is a child's story, is it not? Yeah, but it's too scary for children. It's about lying and dying, lying and dying, and the vanity of believing in resurrection. You said the real boy was resurrected. No, the wooden boy was resurrected, which gave him a second chance at dying, only this time for real. Wooden boys don't die. They're like storybook characters that live on even after the story's over. I would not like it then. I am a Christian. There was a movie about it, was there not? Yes, a Disney movie, but it left out all the scary parts. And the vanity of believing in resurrection. Did the movie leave that out? Yes, it did. And perhaps I would like the Disney movie. I believe in the resurrection. Thanks. Sigrid, can you unmute me for a second? I just wanted to say to Sigrid something. Maybe I need to.
You're unmuted.
I'm unmuted. Okay, I just wanted to say to Sigrid, I was struck by your reading and how overlapping our readings were.
I know, it's amazing. And
fairy tales and everything.
We didn't plan it this way. Well,
No,
we
not at all.
did not plan it this way, but the whole arrangement was not made because of the symmetry. Yes.
Oh no, it just was so lovely that it worked out like
True.
That was really amazing. I know. Thank you so much for those readings. That was wonderful. We do have some questions in the chat. Sophia, would you like to ask the first question?
Absolutely. So we got a question about the relationship between inspiration and form from Lisa Hendrickson. Lisa asks, was it personal experience that prompted you to write about illness? And how did you decide to fictionalize those experiences or ideas as opposed to, say, writing a personal essay?
Well, that's a huge set of questions, actually. It's a whole list almost, and just implied in the several. But I think I can answer them somewhat. I have wanted to try to tell this story for the last few years. This is the first novel I published in 10 years. I had 2 other books in between, short stories and a nonfiction book. But I hadn't really written a novel in that period. And in that period, I entered into my 70s, and as actuarial tables will tell you, I began to confront the gradual loss of many of my friends and old age on my own part. Mortality began to stare me in the face instead of being something beyond the further horizon. And I began to realize that I needed to try to confront this this experience in a direct way, which for me is through writing fiction, writing novels. That's the most direct way I can penetrate any mystery that looms up in front of me. And the mystery that was looming up in front of me in recent years is the mystery of my own mortality and the past, and also the death and of many friends as well. So I couldn't escape it, and that's what really, if you want to talk about inspiration, I guess that's sort of the inspiration. How to do this was a difficult thing to figure out. I've long been very interested in the Americans who went to Canada, American men. Most of them were white, well-educated in the 1960s and early 70s to avoid the war and whatever happened to them. And I have a personal connection to that because I'm Canadian American as well myself. I mean, 3 of my grandparents and my father are Canadian. I have Canadian citizenship as well as American. And I go back and forth, and I've lived most of my adult life on the borders, more or less, in northern New England and now upstate New York. And so the Canadian theme of it was really important to me. And then in the late 90s into the 20s, I started working with filmmakers and on a couple of projects, and then ongoing, and then writing screenplays and so on. And I began to think about the differences and similarities between filmmaking and fiction, and how one might be able to engage those differences in a dramatic way, in a narrative way. And I think that probably was lying underneath my beginning to figure out how to structure the story. Then there's one further factor I might throw in, and that's very personal, but not that secretive in any sense, of that a man I'm very, very fond of, my father-in-law, was in his late 80s going through dementia, and during dementia, and I spent a lot of time with him, and I began to see what he was experiencing, which was essentially confabulation, and how he was assembling his mental and emotional life out of a mingling of actual literal memories and real experiences and dreams and fantasies and fears and movies and books he had read and stories he had heard and things that happened this morning at breakfast were all mingling together into a narrative that was for him his immediate concrete reality. And I became kind of fascinated with that state of mind and was able to connect it to many things, to the making of any kind of narrative, fictional or otherwise, and the nature of memory itself, and the unreliability of it, and yet the inescapability of it, and our utter reliability on it nonetheless. And so all these things kind of came together for me and gave me, opened the gates so that I could write the novel.
Great, Russell, thank you for that. Could Sigrid, could you answer that same question?
Well, I'll say one thing, just about everything that Russell said is something that's familiar to me. I mean, all these, the same kinds of ideas coming to me at this time in my life. In fact, there was somebody who had asked the question, thinking about both this book and other books of mine, why are you so drawn to mortality? And I said, well, it's not really so much a question of me being drawn to mortality as mortality drawing me to it. But as far as I mean, it would never have occurred to me to write an essay about this. I mean, but because I'm not an essayist, even if I have written essays. And it's true. You have something you want to write about. You have to find the form. And for me, the form that worked best for dealing with this kind of material in this book and in my previous book is a kind of a hybrid where where I have a lot of freedom. I can make everything up, which I do. I can imagine, like in this case, I wanted to explore this idea. This friend asks the narrator, she says, I'm in possession of certain euthanasia drugs because there's no hope for me, and I am, I'm planning on taking my own life before nature takes its full course. And I need somebody to help me, not to give the drugs, but just to be with me at the end. Anyway, this was, to me, I was thinking, well, what would you do? I wanted to imagine that. Imagine if someone asked you that, what would you do? And then what would that be like? And then what would it be like to be in a position where you were planning, how you were going to end it. But all of those, to deal with all of that, I think you need fiction. You need to be using your imagination in a situation like that to really explore it in the way that I wanted to, and obviously Russell did too. And I'm reminded of something of Doris Lessing, who wrote both autobiographical nonfiction and fiction that was autobiographical. I forget which book she was working on, but she had written about her life, coming of age, all aspects of her life up until middle age in her fiction. And then she decided that she was going to write a memoir. And she sat down and tried to write a memoir about this particular period in her youth, and it wasn't working. And so she threw it, and then she wrote, I think it was called The Sweetest, I cannot remember the title right now. But she took the same material and wrote the novel. And then she made the statement that certainly does ring true in a lot of ways to me. She said she discovered that that fiction was the better way to get at the truth. When she tried to write it as nonfiction, it didn't come. So that's a mystery that writers are very familiar with. And so it isn't like you have to decide, well, should I write an essay about this or should I write a story about it? You're already thinking about it in terms of a work of imagination.
Thank you, Sigrid. We have another question here, and let's see.
While Jennifer's looking, I've got another one about craft
Great.
based on that other question. Sigrid, you mentioned how crucial imagination is in writing. And I know a massive amount of research also goes into these projects. So how do you, both Sigrid and Russell, synthesize these elements of preparation to set yourself up to sit down and write something as large as a novel?
Well, this book in particular didn't require a great deal of research. Some other work I've done, like a book that a large part of which was set in Vietnam, where I've never been, did require a lot of research. But my way of doing it is to be writing and doing the research at the same time. I'm not one of those people who could sit down and then do the research. I mean, I would get bored with it very quickly like that. I just know myself. So, you know, what I have done, it sounds counterproductive, but I've done this all the time, and it's a habit I can't change. Um, I try to make it up out of, even though I might be ignorant about the situation. I try to invent it first. I try to imagine it first. And then when it's done, then I go back and do the research, and then I have to fix certain things. And this goes back to this idea that you write because you want to use your imagination. In fact, I'll take a kind of silly example. It just so happens that I was at Woodstock. I was one of those people. I actually went to that concert. Okay. I was not at Altamont. That I did not go to. Okay. When I wrote a novel and I wanted to have my characters, the novel The Last of Her Kind, set in the 60s, I wanted to have my characters go to a festival like that. I wanted to have them go somewhere and have this experience. I had them go to Woodstock, and like a lot of people in real life, get there too late to get in. So they didn't get there. Okay. Instead, I sent them to where I had never been and didn't know anything about, Altamont. And then I had to do all that research in order to write it. Now, obviously, it would have been a lot easier for me to send them to Woodstock and write about Woodstock, but I'm not writing about myself. I want to use my imagination. And in another book I wanted to send my my couple in my second novel, I wanted to send them on a kind of second honeymoon. Now, by the time I was writing that book, I had been to Paris, I had been to London, I had been to other European cities. That's where I wanted to send them. I had never been to Venice. That's where I sent my characters. And somebody said, well, as long as you don't have somebody park a car, okay, so I'd never been to Venice. So I sent them there. I read some things about Venice, guidebooks, other things, and I wrote it. And then after the book was finished, and it was actually in production, I did go to Venice. And I did not have to change one thing, because you can really trust your imagination. It's amazing. But for me, the things like that, are what makes me understand how I wanted to be a writer, because I wanted to lie my head off. Not because I wanted to be a journalist of a sort.
Yeah, I think there's two kinds of research, and one is employed mainly like biographers and historians and maybe journalists too, which I call front loading, where you do the research first. And then there's what novelists do, which I call research on a need to know basis. And you don't know what you need to know until you get to that point in the scene, and I can think of any number of occasions where I said, like in a historical novel, I wrote a novel that was set in the 1850s, and I had a family living in the country in northern New York State, and they went down for breakfast. Now, I needed to know, what did a family who was having a rural family having breakfast in upstate New York in 1848 have for breakfast? That's a need to know. So then I had to go out and do the research in order to find out what they ate for breakfast. But that's a novelist's way of thinking about research.
That is so great. I love that research on a need to know basis. I have a question that has come in from Alan Brown. And he said that it's so interesting that both of your novels draw on fairy tales. Do they feature throughout the story? Why do you think that they became important to you in each of these novels?
Sigrid?
Well, for me, fairy tales were really the beginning for me of becoming a writer. I mean, I wanted to become a writer because I was read to and then learned to read. And I thought this was such a wonderful thing. This is what I want to do, produce things that other people will read. And the the earliest stories were fairy tales and Greek myths. Those were the first things that the first literature that I was exposed to. And I've always loved fairy tales. I've always had a passionate love for fairy tales. And but they haven't figured, you know, I'm not a writer of fairy tales, and they don't, except for this mention here, they're not throughout the book. I don't bring up fairy tales elsewhere in the book, no.
Well, they are, though. They're the repositories, in a way, in an organized narrative format of the terrible ambiguities of human life, and so we turn to them because they're concrete, substantial, coherent image systems that allow us to enter into those ambiguities in a way we might never get there otherwise. I mean, I use the Pinocchio story there, and it appears here and there again, but only in the background. But it was a way for me to think coherently about what would otherwise be scattered and more or less incoherent. And the character of Fife does the same thing. He uses the story. How can you be both Geppetto and Pinocchio? Well, that's sort of the name of the story that I'm writing here. And it was a beautiful way for me to think about the story and for him to relate it to the reader. Well, to relate it to Renee, his nurse, and then relate it indirectly then to the reader.
We also have a question asking Sigrid, since she has such a wonderful reading voice, if she will consider doing her own audio books in the future instead of someone else recording them.
I suppose I would consider it. It sort of hasn't come up. I mean, I know some people do their own audio books, but I don't know. I mean, it's never been offered to me or suggested to me to do it. I guess I don't know. Russell, have you done any of your audio books?
No, I haven't. It has been suggested on a couple of occasions, and the idea of being locked up in a booth and having to read your own work for 14 hours, and then and of course it would take much more than 14 because you'd make mistakes. You'd have to reread certain pages and passages. No, it's never attracted me in the slightest. Not only that, I've never listened to any of my own books on audio because I just don't want to hear them in somebody else's voice than my own in a funny way. So I'm somewhat detached from the process of audio. I'm grateful for them. I'm really glad that people can get on their Peloton and read my books, but I don't have any desire to participate in the process.
We have a lot of fiction students in the audience, and we have several of our prose teachers here as well. And I'm wondering what advice maybe each of you would have for emerging writers, people who are working on their first novels, if you could think back to that experience and maybe some tidbits for them to encourage them and keep them going.
Mm.
Well, I mean, I like to encourage everybody who wants to write to read and read and read and read. And aside from reading all kinds of different things, because that is extremely enriching anyway, to try to figure out when reading, you know, to read as a writer, as we say, like, so that you when you're working on something, you know, but if you read a lot, you'll have a lot of resources as a writer. For example, you're trying to do something in your book and you think to something that you've read and you said, yes, that writer, that's what I'm trying to get here, that kind of natural sounding dialogue. Now, how do you do that? Well, you know, it's much harder to get that kind of learning from a workshop, right? If you find a writer who is doing that thing that you're trying to do really well, and of course you recognize it because you're a good reader, then you can go and look at it and study it and really take it apart and see what kind of, how was it put together, and so there's that. And I also think to try to, and this I think is very difficult for people, maybe even increasingly difficult, is to keep in mind that, write what you want to write, not what you think you should be writing. I mean, that's been said many times, but in particular in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, with the way she put it, write what you want to write. And if it turns out to be for the ages or just for an hour, that's not for you to say, so I think that's very good advice.
Yeah, to reinforce with the latter part of what you're saying, especially, I haven't taught since 1998, and so that means I haven't read a student manuscript since 1998, and I'm not sure what it would be like if I had to read one now. And I think I would not be anywhere near as skillful a reader as I was when I was teaching. Once I stepped out of teaching, I stopped thinking about the process in that sense and the craft in that sense. But I used to say to my students, and still on occasion too, say that the worst thing you can do, and maybe it's better to say what you shouldn't do rather than what you should do on occasion, because it's hard to know what you should do. Maybe the worst thing you can do is confuse your work with your career and try to keep them on completely separate tracks, because your career you can't control, but the work is the only thing you can control. So concentrate on that and forget the career. Now, that's a really easy thing to say, of course, to a young writer, ambition and so on. But I think it's essential. And it more or less reaffirms what you were saying at the end of your remarks too, Sigrid.
Yeah, because I mean, I think if you're beginning, it just seems to me that it's just too burdensome. I mean, if you're trying to write, if you're going to also be thinking about your career, I just think that way lies writer's block.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah, or bad writing.
yeah, I mean, because because there's just so many different things coming at you, because there's so many elements to the career. But what kind of career are you talking about? Are you talking about something, you want something to sell many copies, or you want the best reviews, or you want to be treated like, like at the very height of the literary whatever.
And you can't control it.
And you can't control
it's out of your hands entirely.
Yeah, way too many variables.
I mean, you and I know that really well. I mean, that
Right.
neither of us have had any control over our careers. They've all been in the hands of other people.
It's true, and that's their job.
For better and worse.
Yes. One other piece of advice that I've always liked is you never assume that your reader is not as intelligent as you are.
Oh, that's very good. You're right.
And I think that can save you from many sins, from being over explicit.
Yeah.
Which is hard not to be, because you're always thinking, well, is this going to be am I making myself clear? So I think is really quite
Yeah,
good.
trust the reader.
Yeah.
Trust the reader. Jennifer?
Yes. Well, we have a comment here from Don Stever, and he is Margot's husband. Margot's the founder of the center, and Don, in the early 70s, Russell Banks and Don lived in New Hampshire, in Northern Narrows, and he was in Concord. And Don wanted to remind you that he subscribed to the little magazine edited by you and Bill Matthews.
Right.
And he wandered over to Northwood Meadows to meet with you. Not only did I meet with you, but also your interesting neighbor, Sylvana Sensi, the dynamite sculptor.
Yeah.
And he said this was a very interesting time in his life. So
Well, it was a very interesting time. I see you, Don Stever, on the screen here. It was a very interesting time in my life as well. That was in the middle 70s, I think, and early 70s, really. And I was editing a magazine that I had founded with Bill Matthews and a couple of other friends and writers in Chapel Hill in North Carolina in the late 60s, and ran it on into the middle 70s and so on. And then after I had resettled up in New Hampshire again. And it was a very important period in my life. I don't know how important it was in your life, but I have a feeling it was, living in Concord, New Hampshire for you, and out there in Northwood, New Hampshire for me. But it was the formative years and the most important ones. And there was so much that occurred then that I returned to it again and again in memory. And then most recently, I've been working on a long short story. It's not a long short story. Is that a contradiction? It's a 75-page story, maybe a novella before I get it done. That is set in Northwood, New Hampshire, and it's set in the house that that I lived in at the time, which you perhaps remember, and a woman like Silvana Cenci, who was a wonderful, eccentric, and energetic, and brilliant sculptor. Steel. She worked in steel, just in the neighborhood. So I've returned to that period.
Well, that's totally cool. I mean, they called her the dynamite lady because what she did is she basically strapped a dynamite on the back of large steel plates and blew them up.
Yeah, right.
That's what she did.
I know. We would hear the booms of Silvana's explosions going off in the middle of the afternoon.
Yeah, I was a young assistant attorney general, and you know, I mean, I loved the little magazine. I mean, I was one of these weird people who, you know, read poetry as a lawyer.
Not that weird. Not that weird.
Sophia, do we have another question from the group?
We don't have another question from the group, but to follow up on the wonderful discussion that's been happening so far, I would love if both of our speakers tonight could maybe say a little bit more about how they discovered fiction in particular as one of the best ways, or the best way for them most recently to write about and discover the truth of a particular situation or theme.
Well, I think it starts with those fairy tales. It starts, and not just fairy tales. I think it starts with when you're a little kid. In fact, I've always been curious about when that, how that point comes. You know, you're a child, and you're hearing a lot of fiction, you know, in stories and the fairy tales, the children's books, everything, right? And you know that a lot of it has things like talking animals and something. You know that it's not true. You know that it's fiction, even if you haven't learned that word yet. At the same time, you're always being told that it's a very bad thing to tell a lie. You should always tell the truth. So I'm very curious, like when the human being figures out that there's this other kind of lying that's very good, and that's very helpful, and that you get rewarded for, and that people like, and so on. But when you know, when it happens that you make that distinction, and I think that's when you discover something about fiction and the truth, that even if you can't articulate it. So I think it's just that. I think it's just you know, people are storytellers and story listeners. It's just who we are.
Yeah. I'm not quite in agreement there altogether. I think something about storytelling is innate in some people and not in others. And I'm thinking of my own two parents and the example that I had going back to early childhood, and my father and my mother. And if I, as I often did, my father would come home from work and I would say, "How was your day today, Dad?" And he would say, "Okay," or "Okay, right." And he would that was the end of it. That was his report. But if I said to my mother, "How was your day today, Mom?" she'd say, "You'll never guess who I met today at the bus stop on my way to work." And then it would be a narrative, a story. She would tell a story. And it would be a boring story, but it would be a story. And it would be about exchange of dialogue, and it would be an arc to it, and there would be a resolution at the end. And I got on the bus and she got on with me, and we'd be friends ever since, or something like that. But she had an innate storytelling impulse, or a way of organizing the phenomenology of existence into a narrative. My father had none of that. He resisted it. He was afraid of it because it involves, as you say, entry and invention, and a willingness to apply form to the chaos of experience, narrative form. And my mother had no fear of doing that. In fact, she lived by it. And I know that I probably had the similar kind of temperament and impulse and desire as my mother had, that preceded any kind of connection to fairy tales or to any idea that stories might be interesting in their own sake, for their own sake, or it was just a way of organizing the chaos of experience, and that I grasped in childhood, early childhood. But I think that's temperamental too. Like I have, I have 3 siblings, and none of them really had that same impulse. They're brilliant and wonderful people, and yet they don't organize our shared experience into the narratives that I will impulsively, quickly, without reference to anything else. So it seems innate to me almost.
I think you're absolutely right. But if you're not, for the most part, maybe those who aren't that kind of storyteller, there's still people who want to hear stories.
Oh, thank God.
So thank God, right? So what I mean is, like, as a group, we're storytelling.
Species, yeah.
It's part of it's a deep part of the culture to have stories and storytelling. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are people who just they can't even tell you what their day was like.
Right.
Kind of way they don't feel like they even should, in a way.
I mean, all species seem, at least higher species, maybe all species, love to groom. But the human species is the one that actually needs a story to almost achieve the same that grooming does for other species. It's how we identify what it is for ourselves to be human beings. I mean, what it is, where we came from, where we're going, what's the extent of our property, who are the enemies, should we be afraid of, etc.
Everything.
Yeah. And stories are what do it for us.
Right. And how we woo.
Yes, how do we woo? Yes.
How we woo.
I haven't heard that word in a while. That's nice.
Where's
so
that
nice
from?
to hear that word. Woo.
Word, isn't it? Yes, we wooed.
We have a question from Eileen. She says, both writers are tackling themes of aging in these books, the stark realities there. Is writing about aging more or less challenging, gratifying, or saddening than other themes you've dealt with?
Russell, when did you go first on that one?
No, it isn't. It isn't more challenging. It would have been if I had tried to do it when I was younger, perhaps. But it wasn't when I was younger. Even in my 60s, I'm now 81, so it's inescapable. But in my 60s and before, it was still escapable in some way, and I think that it would have been therefore more difficult. That would have been a greater leap of the imagination for me in some ways, to get there. What it would actually feels like to be facing mortality and its immediacy, and so I think it depended on my reaching this age for me to confront these realities. I don't know how you feel about that, Sigrid, because you're younger than I am.
It probably would have been harder for me when I was younger to write about aging and death. But on the other hand, it is something I, talk about doing research, as it were. It is something that I paid a lot of attention to. It seems to me I've always been interested in it. And so, I feel like using other people's experiences. I mean, because reading biographies and so on, people have written so well about it. So much beautiful poetry about it. It's so much a part of life. So, what I would like to say, though, is that something that really strikes me is that the one thing about aging that's kind of surprising is that it really is anything but boring.
Oh, yes.
Boring.
That's
The mortality, the aging, the nearness of the mortality. Like you would maybe, I think when you're young, you think, well, I won't have, I'll just be this boring person. It'll be a boring thought. Everything about it will be boring. That's so boring. And I want everyone who's young to keep thinking like that.
Because the intensity increases as you get older. The intensity of living just gets higher and higher and higher.
Right. And the actual things that happen when you're aging, like how your mind, the way you feel about things, it's anything but boring. And that really did take me by surprise, I have to say.
Yeah, that's good.
Now, actually, because Hemingway has been on people's minds because of that PBS series.
Yeah.
So somewhere in there, I can't remember which one of the stories it was, but some very autobiographical passages, there are so many in his work, where he talks so much about death, and he then says something like that, really it's boring. It's what death is going to be. It's going to be boring. In fact, it's not going to be this distinguished experience. It's just going to be boring. That's what death is. It's boring. So it's just interesting. I mean,
he was only 61 when he died, so he was young.
he was young, but he had, because of all the things that had happened to him and the heavy drinking and so on, he really was aged. He was an old 61, a very old 61, and mentally and emotionally and physically.
And physically, I know.
Yeah, oh gosh.
Deterioration of that episode, the last episode of those three, is really depressing.
Extremely depressing. And I think a little bit too much about the life and not enough about the work.
Yeah.
I felt, I mean, because you're interested in him for the work. The life is fascinating, but other people have had alcoholism, bad marriages, suicidal, have had all the things that happened to him, have happened to many, many people and are happening to many people right now. But only Hemingway wrote Hemingway, I mean, that was what was interesting about him, was what he did with his work. So I felt that when they kept going on and on about the marriages and what was wrong with the marriages, it's not that I'm not interested, particularly as a novelist. I'm extremely interested in people and whatever, but I thought, why am I watching? Why is this all about his personal, I would like to hear other writers talking about his work. I'd like to hear about more about the critical reception.
Yeah, I agree.
More passages from his journals and letters, whatever, rather than, how this wife was a bitch and he was calling this one this, and, I mean, because I could go out on the street and find that. I don't have to go to Hemingway to find a bad marriage.
Right. No, well, it's celebrity and branding, of course. And that's the dominant way of perceiving human beings in the media today is through celebrity and branding. And he was he almost invented that for the 20th century for literary figures anyhow, how to be a brand. And he became a brand. He was advertising Ballantine's Scotch in the pages of Look magazine long before any other writer was ever asked to endorse the product.
I think that we have time for one more question. Garfield Charles has a question for both of you. What, if anything, do you sacrifice as a writer? Are sacrifices necessary for creating art?
Yeah. I can say, I know I sacrificed my economy, aspects of my economy. I sacrificed the aspects of my life which would have been well dedicated to the lives of my children. I sacrificed aspects of my marriage. I should pluralize that, marriages. And I've sacrificed friendships for it. Around the age of 22, 21, 22, I began to organize my life around my writing. And once I did that, once I made that the center of my life, everything else had to play second fiddle, as it were. Everything else was secondary to me. And it really has remained so, really up to now, into my 80s. And so as a result, I've had to sacrifice. Other people have had, I should reverse it, the polarity of that. Other people have sacrificed for my writing. Maybe that's a better way to think about it than to speak of it. My wives, my children, my parents, even my siblings and friends have had to sacrifice for my writing.
Well, with that, I don't mean this to sound so dramatic, but but I feel like I basically sacrificed everything in order to be able to write. Now, I always want to be careful about this because I never want to seem to be saying that if you're a woman, you can't have children. And so, I mean, I have all kinds of friends who are writers and who are women who have children. However, I can only talk about myself. And it's just like, as Russell was saying, it was early on when I knew I had to organize my life so that I could write. I was not one of those women who was going to be able to do that. I did not feel that I would have done the great job that quite a few people I know, women I know, have been doing. They have their 2 children, they have their writing careers. However, now, those women I'm talking about have partners who understand something about sharing and about certain kinds of needs and equality. That but back then that's not what would have happened if you were the woman and you were going to have the children. That you would not be able to count on. They were going to be yours, and you were the one who was going to have the responsibility. And I didn't think that I would be able to do the writing I wanted to do and be a mother. And then, also I avoided, because as Russell was saying, you don't know, you have no control over your career. So I didn't want to take any kind of serious job, and I never did. I just, these teaching jobs that writers have are incredibly demanding. It's not just that you're teaching the classes; you've got all kinds of committee work and just many things. So I always kept my teaching to a minimum and would accept, visiting writer positions or adjunct positions, but I never applied for a real teaching job. That's a very rare thing. I don't know anyone who could say that. I mean, every writer I know has wanted to have a more security than that. So I really did sacrifice any kind of security. But I knew I wanted to write, and that it was the most important thing, and that I was just going to have to be that way. I was not going to have a normal life. What most people would think of as a normal life. I never got married. I never had children. I don't have a family, and I live in one room. So I kind of I still kind of live like a grad student. But and I have taught. I've had some very good teaching positions, but as I say, that's a career in itself. And but I've always been that way. I'm the kind of person I can only do, it's just my own limitations. I'm somebody who always only wanted to do one thing well. That's my personality. That's who I am. And I knew very early on that the rest was just going to be too much of a distraction. So in some ways, the older I am, the easier that life is, because when you're younger, there really are all these distractions. And of course, there was all these times where I thought, no, I'm wrong. I'm going to have the children. This is crazy. They have children. But I don't regret any of this. I just know, and am satisfied to know, or I feel like I it's okay with me to know that by choosing this life, I've also then missed out on some of life's greatest experiences, such as having children and marriage. But sacrifice is a big part of a writer's life, whether you're married or have children or don't. It just is. Sacrifice and rejection. People don't, when we're talking about advice for younger people, you have to understand that rejection is a very, very, very big part of any writer's life.
No, I'm glad you brought it back around to that, because we were talking earlier about advice to young writers and all this. Be prepared for rejection. I some of those brilliant young writers of the next younger generation or two at Columbia and at Princeton for many years. And the thing I used to advise was say, you think you're the best possible writer of your generation, but be prepared for at least 10 years of rejection. And I think probably 20 would be better. And then 20 years later, they published their first novel, but they had to be prepared for 20 years of rejection.
I agree. And just one more thing, because I'm thinking of Hemingway again, because I was talking about him in that program with somebody. I said, here's this person who was, lionized, to say the least, such a cliche in his case. But also, I mean, here he's had this career where he was treated, like a literary god, like the greatest thing that could possibly have happened to American literature. And then there were these other times where people were throwing tomatoes at him, basically.
Yeah, right.
He treated like dirt. I mean, even when he was, here he was the most famous writer in the world, but he was, people didn't hesitate to say the worst possible things about him in print, and to say that he was no good. So he's a really great example of a ridiculous career, actually, completely incoherent in many ways.
Oh, totally incoherent. It makes no sense.
Completely incoherent. And again, it's because there was no control over it.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, I hope we've been enlightening and helpful. This has been a great pleasure for me to talk
really
with
fun.
you.
It's been fun talking with you, Sigrid. I enjoyed it so much. We really have to figure out a way to get together in person.
Yeah, all of us. I wish we were there in the place.
I know.
And someday I hope you have an open invitation, the two of you, to come and read together there when we reopen after this pandemic is over.
Lovely.
We would really love to do that. And what a great pairing this was. It kind of just happened by accident.
Well, the two books overlap in really fascinating ways. I was delighted, by it.
And thank you for letting us record it. And thank you for being here. We are saving the chat for you. So we will send that to you so you can read all of the things that everyone wrote to you in the chat, and all of the comments, and all of the appreciation that you had tonight from your audience. Thank you so much. This really was the best Q&A that we have had on Zoom. It was absolutely fantastic. And it was such an honor to have the two of you here together.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Sophia. And thank you, Sigrid, especially.
Thank you. Bye. Goodbye. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much for being here. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.